Good morning, welcome back to the Celtic Way. I'm your host, John McGinley. I'm joined by Ryan McGinley again. We were planning on having Tony on this morning, but he's feeling a little bit under the weather, so it's us two again, as it was yesterday. But we've got plenty of Celtic chat to take you through today. Ryan, how are you doing this morning?
Things are good, yeah. Enjoying being on the briefing quite a bit this week. Always good to get back into it, back into the swing of things. Yeah, I'm doing not too bad. How are you?
Yeah, not bad at all. Before we get into a variety of topics, first, just from our sponsor, Seneca Medical Group, the number one hair transplantation clinic in the UK. They've got clinics in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen, and they're our sponsor for the coming season. So we thank them as always. Ryan, what's on your mind in the sphere of Celtic today? Can you take us through what's the situation with Maik Nawrocki, the kind of news that kind of broke from last night from Polish media?
Yeah, no, on apologies in advance if I butcher the Polish team's name. I've been trying to get it right. I was actually on another podcast last night and I was trying to get it right there as well. I think you can use Wojciech Szczesny's name as a bit of a guide when talking about this team, because it's very, very similar in terms of grammatically. But Maik Nawrocki has been linked with a move away from Celtic on loan, back to his native Poland. That broke about 4 or 5 o'clock last night in the Scottish media or in the Polish media. It was actually tagged along to myself, so I put it on the website. The team that he is linked with is Pogoń Szczecin, who play in the Ekstraklasa, the top flight of Polish football. Now that he's getting linked with a move back to the Polish top flight, they actually finished fourth in the Polish top flight last season. They finished above his former team, Legia Warsaw. It was Lech Poznan that won the league in Poland that season. So it looks as if Maik Nawrocki's future, despite having a couple of really good performances here and there when coming in, when drafted into the team, looks as if his future is elsewhere other than Celtic, to be honest.
It's felt like that for a while, isn't it? I think if there is a loan option there for him, that it'd be wise for him to take it. I always forget, Nawrocki's only 24. He comes across to me as older. I don't know why that is. I don't know why in my head he feels older than he is, but he's still just 24. I think he is on his way out of Celtic as well, regardless of this link. I think it's been quite apparent he's not in Brendan Rodgers' plans or isn't fancied by him. Some will argue whether that is fair on the player or not, Ryan. Some people want to see more of Maik Nawrocki. Some people think that he hasn't been given enough of a chance under Brendan Rodgers. Where do you kind of fall down on that?
It's one of those ones where we only see so much of a player. We see the 90 minutes or maybe not even 90 minutes that they play. But the time that they spend on the pitch when playing a game, that's what we see. For Brendan Rodgers, he sees them every single day, and his coaches, he sees them every single day in training, and he'll make his mind up about a player both in training and in games. I think he's went on record in the past to say that training is just as important as actual games, because if you don't train well, not to say that Nawrocki isn't a good trainer, but sometimes managers are looking for something a little bit different, and he might just not have that required ability in a Brendan Rodgers team in training. From what I've seen in the flesh, watching him in person, I've been pretty impressed by him. I think he looks like a good defensive player. He looks like a decent passer of the ball. I think maybe the one thing going against him is his lack of speed, which was actually talked about the other way when he was coming to the club. I remember watching clips of him prior to his move to Celtic, and people were talking about how quick he was going to be, particularly on in transition when trying to get back and defending. But I don't think he's that quick a defender. The same can be said for Gustav Lagerbielke. I just think the point I was making last night as well, going back to 2023, the summer of 2023, that was a really, really poor transfer window for Celtic. That day, Nawrocki was paraded alongside Yang Hyun-jun and Kwon Hyuk-kyu on the same day. I remember the three of them getting pictures taken at the same time at Lennoxtown. Only really Yang has any sort of, you would say, future at the club, and even then, that's up in the air, especially after the cup final. So I think better recruitment is required after that summer. Thankfully, it seems as if that seems to be in place. But in the case of Nawrocki, it looks as if his future is going to be elsewhere, which is unfortunate. He's still young enough to go back to Poland if he is to go there, and then maybe get a move elsewhere. Though I thought he would be going to maybe a better team than the team that he's been linked with at the moment.
Couple of things here. Brown Warrior saying, not Brown Warrior, Pete McGee saying we shouldn't sell Nawrocki, he's easily as good as Trusty Scales. I have seen that sentiment amongst other Celtic supporters. So that is a kind of talking point that is doing the rounds. Brown Warrior asking, does this mean we have a replacement lined up? So let's talk about the central defensive position as a whole. If Nawrocki does leave, what does this mean for Stephen Welsh? What does this mean for Dane Murray? Does it mean Celtic go back into the market and sign another defender? I think a fair amount of Celtic supporters would say it's a positional priority anyway this summer, regardless of who leaves, because I think people determine that there could be an upgrade to that left centre-back slot alongside Cameron Carter-Vickers. So where does this leave all Brendan Rodgers' options? Is it one defender Celtic need? Is it two? What happens? Because it seems like there's a lot of central defenders on the books, Ryan, but only a couple of them are really rated by the Celtic support.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I'm more concerned, or maybe not, concerned's not the word, but I think there's more of a question mark on Austin Trusty as well, due to the fact that Celtic paid £6 million for his services, and yet, with all due respect, Scales has done well when coming into the team. He's not really let the side down all that often. But, Celtic signed him from Shamrock Rovers. He went out on loan and came back, and now he's a first-team player. You would have thought that with Trusty coming into the squad on deadline day last year, he would immediately just take that place with Cameron Carter-Vickers, and that hasn't been the case. Yes, he's played games, and I think he's performed well in a lot of the games that he's played in. But for the good games that he's played, you can also point out the not so good games in which he's maybe been spooked by a more physical player, kind of akin to the way that Julian was sometimes when he was playing against a physical specimen. I seem to remember against Dundee United, he was really struggling, or not Dundee United, Dundee, when he was struggling against Simon Murray up front and a couple of their other attackers. So I think for me, there is more of a question mark. Maik Nawrocki, I think his future's been sealed, and I think it will be elsewhere, because Brendan Rodgers' squad lists and squad selections would tell you that. And a player's not going to be happy with playing 5-6 games this season. So I think he will move on. But I think there's more of a question mark over Austin Trusty, because if you're a £6 million defender and you're not getting played at Celtic, then what's happening? £6 million players should be playing at Celtic. I don't think Celtic have the finances to accommodate £6 million players on the bench.
Yeah. Just that feeds into this overall theme that Celtic summer is challenging in this quiet period, as we all kind of perceive what's ahead and think about what's ahead. Celtic have a lot of work to do, both outgoings and incomings, as we know. I think what strikes me, Ryan, and this is going to be inevitable, there's going to be, because what happens when there's a change at Celtic or Rangers, the narrative starts to become the challenge coming from the other club who were successful the previous season. So we're going to get a lot from media, even from supporters, like what sort of challenge we get from Rangers. I don't want to talk about that today. That's not what I'm driving at here. I'm not talking about the challenge from Rangers here, because although I think that is going to be the narrative, and that suits people who want to kind of pursue this kind of this box office story of two clubs going toe-to-toe in this rivalry. For me, I think the biggest challenge this summer and beyond for Celtic is internally. It's not from really outside forces or outside clubs. It's really about what Celtic do internally and the challenges they overcome internally. And we've spoken about this a lot this week, and I'm coming round to the kind of the final conclusion before I head off on a break. This is my last show, by the way, for a week or so you won't be seeing me on the channel for a wee while. I'm away off on my own holidays, but before I kind of go away and I'm kind of thinking about this period and what's ahead, it strikes me that Celtic do have internal challenges, and I don't think it's all down to intent, because people often talk, and the word that's going around is complacency. Celtic can't be complacent, and I think that's valid. I do think there's a sense of Celtic need to be willing to spend their resources. My concern is that the challenges go beyond that, and Celtic perhaps don't have the expertise in key positions, or don't have as many football specialist roles in recruitment that we need to get some of these deals over the line. And is our scouting good enough, etc.? For me, it's less about intent and more about, are Celtic up to the challenge? Because frankly, if you look at last summer's transfer window and you put it into the context of this year, all of the signings that were made, or the majority of the signings that were made, would have been far too late to have any tangible impact on this upcoming Champions League playoff. And so the timeline is more urgent this summer, and we need to see Celtic as a club answer the questions that persist around recruitment, around their ability to go into the market and deliver the signings that Brendan Rodgers wants. The January transfer window was not good enough by a lot of people's standards, in the sense that they failed to replace their main striker, and Brendan Rodgers was public that he wanted that to happen. And so it strikes me there's a lot of question marks, it feels like, around the club, despite, and sorry, I will let you speak in a minute, but despite winning the Scottish Premiership last year and the Scottish League Cup, a League and Cup double, that's all in the past now. It largely doesn't matter when we're thinking about what's ahead. And so does Celtic have what it takes, Ryan? And your gut feeling, does Celtic have what it takes to deliver what supporters, what Brendan Rodgers wants over the next few months?
I mean, the thing is, they've done it in the past. I guess it's been a while ago since they've had that real standout window. But I think that was more down to necessity than anything else. You look at the amount of hits that they had, particularly under Ange Postecoglou's first season. I know that's in the recent past. It's still a wee while ago, but it was in the recent past. How many hits they got, the likes of even the late signings. I know we're talking about earlier signings, but those late signings coming in, that triple of Jota, Giakoumakis and Cameron Carter-Vickers. But you also had guys like Juranovic, you had guys like Starfelt, Kyogo came in earlier on in the window. They do have it in them. This scouting team have it in them to deliver for the manager. It's just all about that intent and that hunger. And you're hoping that Celtic are hungry this summer, both for a repeat of the domination domestically and to push further in the Champions League. I don't want to be settling for just getting to the group stage or the league phase of the Champions League. I want Celtic to be kicking on and really making themselves a sort of household name in Champions League football again. You want to think about the league phase and say, right, Celtic are always there. Regardless if they qualify automatically or through qualifiers, they're always there. And Celtic can do that by building a strong team and by backing Brendan Rodgers with the players that he needs to succeed. I think it's all about, yes, getting squad depth in the team, because I think the squad depth was shown for what it is, which is not that much in the final. I know obviously you're missing Hatate, and that was a big miss in the middle of the park, but that squad depth, you're bringing on Johnny Kenny, you're bringing on Jeffrey Schlupp, who was leaving the club a couple of weeks later. These guys coming on, the squad depth just isn't there, so it's all about replacing that. I think it's about getting quality and quantity this summer, getting good players, but also beefing up the squad so that they're ready to fight on four fronts next season.
And that's where the concern again, because the 2023 window was what it was, as you alluded to at the start of the programme. There's a lot of these players who are on lengthy contracts that. So who turns around at Celtic and says, well, we've got these players in the building, utilise them to the best of your capability? Is that how it works? Is there a schism there? Or, does Celtic need to be completely aligned and say, Brendan Rodgers, we want to give you the players you want, regardless of who is already within the club, we'll move them on? Does there just be a bit of a realisation that this is a summer for a refresh, not a reset, because I think that's too strong a word, but a refresh, and consider almost a clean slate within the squad, no one's place is secure, etc., just fully execute on where Brendan Rodgers wants to go with the squad unit, which I'm sure he is assessed by this point.
Yeah, and I think the manager and Paul Tisdale as well, they need to be ruthless, and they need to look at players. They need to look at players both in the short term and the long term. Are these players going to make it at Celtic in the next 2-3 years? Are they just project players? I know Celtic have been trying to get fewer and fewer of these players, but I think some still exist in and around the club. I think the club have to be ruthless, as someone say. If they're not going to get to that level where they're fighting for a first team place, then they should be not shown where the door is, but moved on for the sake of their career to get more game time, both either on loan or through permanent solutions by a permanent deal. The club just need to be ruthless. I want them to level up and become the next level of Celtic and really become stronger, because I think in the long term that's what will keep Brendan Rodgers at the club. If you put more projects on him like he did the first time around, bringing through Marian Shved, I think we all remember his press conference when he said, I don't even know who that is, we've got 1 million wingers at the club. The panic, the alarm started to go when he said that. In my mind, Ollie Burke was brought into the club, Timo Weah as well, round about that time. Vacuum Bio. I'm just naming all the players that were brought into the club in 2019. I still remember it very clearly, but I think it's all about bringing both quantity and quality into this team. It's time for Celtic to go to the next level, and I think Brendan Rodgers can take better players to an even higher level if he's trusted with them this summer. But I think the club need to be ruthless in that regard.
What are your thoughts on? And again, this comes up every transfer window. Almost seems like there's a section of online Celtic supporters. There's always a cluster of supporters who are talking about the concept of a sporting director or a director of football. Where do you land on that, Ryan? I think for me personally, I understand the concept of having a specialist role that isn't just about scouting, that oversees the entire football department, and perhaps as much as anything, Ryan, communicates an effective football vision for the club going forward. Mm-hmm. That is part of the modern sporting director's role, is communication with supporters, setting out expectations. From how I look at it, the burden on that often falls on Brendan Rodgers at the moment. And is that fair? You know, should Brendan Rodgers just be allowed to focus on coaching the team, bringing on the team? You know, obviously speaking about football and matters, but he's often asked about transfers, I think, to the point of his own irritation. And would a specialist role help? You know, be more of a conduit between Rodgers and the Celtic board or whoever pulls the financial strings at Celtic? Where do you come down on it? Because the most successful Celtic managers of my lifetime have been these kind of cult of personality managers: Martin O'Neill, Ange Postecoglou, Brendan Rodgers, Neil Lennon to an extent. These are all really strong, powerful individuals who communicate their own message. But if we're looking at Celtic as a whole, would it be better to have someone in a specialised role, not above Rodgers, but working in tandem with Rodgers on all this recruitment issues?
I actually wouldn't even mind if there was someone just above Rodgers as well that keeps that continuity between managers, because I think the days of managers being the be-all and end-all of a football club are slowly but surely dying, to be honest with you. You look at all the big clubs, the clubs that Celtic will be facing in the Champions League if they are to get there, the vast majority of them have either a director of football or a sporting director, or sometimes even both. They've got both in the same, that go in different areas of the football club and control different areas of the club. For me, I would like to have somebody not fully above. I totally agree with what you're saying, but just a little bit above Brendan Rodgers that keeps that continuity. I think the big problem for me is that there's not really been any dialogue with the likes of Paul Tisdale, who we know likes to speak, we know likes to communicate. That was one of his strong points when coming into the club, that he was an effective communicator. He was this football doctor. I know that Brendan Rodgers kind of laughed at that term when he was asked in a couple of press conferences, but I think that tells you about the confidence of the guy. If he's a consultant, if he was a football consultant, that means he's good at speaking to people and good at speaking to those both higher up and maybe some of the supporters as well. I actually did a piece a few months ago. I might actually try and bring it back for the summer. I was speaking to somebody who knew Paul Tisdale personally and worked with him when he was at Exeter City, and he had nothing but good things to say about him. Said he was such an effective worker, a man manager, because he was manager of Exeter City for something like 12, 13 years. So he's got that experience of being a manager, but he's also a consultancy business as well. For me, I'd like to hear more from him. I think that the club could have done this with Mark Lawwell as well. I know that his tenure at the club was short and maybe not too sweet, but I think even an interview with him for the fans and supporters, and even people like us that cover the club, to hear what they have to say, to have that open dialogue, to hear their ideas, to hear their ambitions for the football club, I think that would go a long way. But sometimes it's easier said than done when it comes to Celtic and dialogue.
I think with regards to that, though, it's also, I mean, these guys get various titles, whatever, but I think functionally within Celtic, Paul Tisdale's role is really heading up a scouting department. You know, it's that kind of day-to-day scouting work that it feels like he has oversight of. And the same could have been said for Mark Lawwell. Do they determine strategy, though? Do they determine vision? Do they work in tandem with the manager on vision for the club? I think that's arguably might be the kind of high-level appointment that Celtic might need. Now, Jerry Smith raises a good point here, and I'm not going to argue against this because I think it's true. He says Brendan doesn't need a sporting director. And I get that. I understand that, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. I think Brendan Rodgers has the personality and has the strength of character to take on the burden on his shoulders. My question is, while Brendan doesn't need a sporting director, do Celtic need a sporting director? across the long term, across a 5 or 10 year period, where Brendan Rodgers, when it doesn't all come down to Brendan Rodgers' contract, Brendan Rodgers' happiness with transfers, Brendan Rodgers this and that creates all these kind of storylines around the club that could potentially be avoided if you have real football specialism in key senior roles.
Yeah, and I was actually going to make that point. I'm glad that you said that as well. Do Celtic need one maybe more than Brendan Rodgers does? Because he has worked without sporting directors and that before. He's used to being the guy that makes all the big decisions. I think just the way that football's going in general, I think that Celtic maybe in the next few years will look to bring in a sporting director. I remember there was quite a lot of talk about Celtic doing that right after the 2020-21 season. The name Fergal Harkin became a bit of a household name among Celtic fans. Sorry to reopen old wounds when it comes to that season, talking about Fergal Harkin. I believe there was an Italian boy that was linked with the club as well, Tugnosi, who I think is going back to Juventus. I heard his name being mentioned a couple of days ago. So there has been talk about that before. It's just I don't think that Celtic have ever pulled the trigger in terms of bringing in a sporting director. I think they've had like head of recruitments with the likes of, Hammond. There's other names, Congerton. That's been
and this is the scouting thing, isn't it? That we're talking about. This is the kind of head of scouting thing that really feels like they are. But
and it feels I don't know. I guess at some point, sorry.
It's, I guess the fact that it's kind of unknown and we're discussing the unknowns around this is probably a signifier that there is a lack of communication from the club sometimes on these matters. And listen, I look around at other clubs in Scotland and England, and sometimes there's very clear communication on the strategy, the football strategy of the club. Now, Celtic seem to, they have the annual report, they have AGM, and you get snippets here and there. I'm not sure the vision for the club and the way the club wants to pick, or the ambition for the club is clearly communicated with supporters enough. I don't know. Yeah, you've just said that yourself there, Ryan, that you perhaps think the club could do more. We don't really hear from Michael Nicholson at all. He is the CEO of the entire club, and we know that he has a big hand in transfers. So what do we know about the recruitment process at Celtic is kind of what I'm getting at here. We know there's an identification of talent, and that's headed up by Paul Tisdale in the scouting department. We know that Brendan Rodgers is obviously a big part of that and the identification of talent. I think then we know it goes over to a negotiating team at Celtic, which I think Michael Nicholson is a key part of.
Yep.
And that seems to be the process and how it works. So we don't really hear from any of these people, like we're saying, other than Brendan Rodgers. And I think putting the burden on all of that sometimes is asking a bit much of him, not because he can't handle it, just because, he's got other things to be thinking and worrying about and talking about, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And my stance, if you would have asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said you want the sporting director or the director of football to be totally separate from the manager. You want him to be his own person for continuity. I'm viewing that softened, and I look particularly at the example of Aston Villa, who have Monchi as the sporting director. Now, if you know anything about Monchi and Unai Emery are very, very close, and that's what works between those two. They know how each other work. They're making a long-term plan, and the results are there. Bringing in guys like Marcus Rashford, Asensio, Morgan Rodgers, etc. Really good talent, and they're all getting identified by Monchi, and Unai Emery's getting the final say. So I wouldn't be against that if Brendan Rodgers was to bring in somebody that he knows. If he is to commit long term to the club, to have that two-way sort of relationship between each other, one person helps and then the other person helps the other way about. But it's a difficult one because we don't hear too much from the club with regard to that. I'd love to hear more about that from me personally. Call me a modern fan or a modern spectator or whatever. But I'd love to hear the developments between sporting directors and the manager. I love to hear how the infrastructure works at the club and how talent's identified and it comes through. Unfortunately, Celtic keep a lot of their cards close to their chest with things like that, but I would like them to be more transparent and open, because I think a lot of people would really enjoy to hear that.
Is there strength in that? Is there strength in keeping your cards close to your chest? Like, what are the benefits? What's the strategy from Celtic there? Do they feel like if they give too much away, then it just creates more questions? And given the thirsty, inquisitive nature of the Celtic support, that it might just create more unwanted storylines or more unwanted kind of thoughts around the club than it would solve? Is there a lack of trust there from the club and the supporters that they would take all of this sensibly and consider it and You know, what is the strategy then?
I don't want to call Celtic fearful, but they seem quite apprehensive to open up any sort of communication relating to that. When I think that could go a long way, not to mending anything, because I don't think they need to fix anything between the supporters, because the supporters and the club are largely in a really good relationship at the moment, and that's because Celtic are doing well on the pitch. And on the whole, a lot of their signings are quite good. Yes, there can be improvements, but a lot of their signings are making a difference when it comes to playing on the park and playing under Brendan Rodgers. But I think that dialogue. I think a lot of people. Sorry to go back again a couple of years, but the dialogue that Don Mackay gave to the supporters in that press conference back in 2021, that was a great insight into what was going to happen to Celtic in the next 2-3 years. It seems as if once he left, we didn't get too much of that from anybody else. You hear snippets here and there about what Celtic want to be, but you don't get too much. I'd love to hear from those higher up in the club to hear what the big plan is. But I guess that's a hope more than an expectation on my part.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and just to bring back to the kind of original point, while everyone's writing and talking about the challenge Celtic face from Rangers, ultimately Celtic's real competition isn't from across the city; it's within themselves, and they need to have like clarity, decisiveness, and take action, and that's really what Celtic fans need to see. And now I'm not saying this in relation to this week. I'm not saying Celtic should have made a barrel load of signings before now. That's not what I'm getting at. That's not what I'm really complaining. I'm just kind of setting the scene for what's ahead, because when I'm thinking about the next few weeks and thinking about Celtic's return to training, to pre-season, I think it's quite clear that Brendan Rodgers wants players in early. Every manager does, and Ange spoke about that a lot as well, like having the player in the building to work with them in pre-season and give them a full pre-season within the Celtic system. Obviously, they're going to have pre-seasons elsewhere and working with clubs elsewhere, but it's just so important. And again, this European game, this playoff, because it doesn't. Ryan, see, when you set your ambition at a European level, you set it higher than Scotland. Competition increases across the board. It's not just about the competition coming from Rangers and the increased competition from Rangers, and that is what everyone talks about in the media and Scottish football supporters. It's all about what is the competition like between the two clubs. But if Celtic are really going to shed all that and shed that baggage and pitch themselves as an ambitious European outfit, then competition is still relevant, because the other clubs around Europe aren't getting any worse, and the clubs going into this playoff process are also looking to improve on where they were this season. That's how football works. You can't stand still.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think that, if Celtic, and I'm just putting it in layman's terms, to be honest with you, but if Celtic sign the players, then the domestic form will go hand in hand. This isn't a risk if you go and sign good players early, because then they'll be ready for the domestic season, but they'll also be ready for your European exploits for those qualifiers. There's been sometimes an apprehension from the club, or at least it looks like that from the outside looking in, to bring in these players before the Champions League, because maybe the money's not guaranteed. Celtic don't have that excuse anymore, unfortunately for them. Everybody knows that Celtic are a wealthy football club, and that's due to good decisions that they've made, some good profits that they've made on players, due to some of the good signings that they've made, and you've got to give them credit. The likes of Matt O'Reilly sold for a very healthy profit, and we'll probably see the fruits of that in the years to come with other players too. But the message has got to be, or the target or ambition has got to be, to bring in these players early so that you're ready for the Champions League qualifiers, because, as you said, the teams that Celtic will be facing will not be any weaker. If anything, they'll be stronger. They'll be wanting to get into that league phase. They'll be wanting to make that breakthrough. For Celtic, they can make it not easy, but easier for themselves by getting these players in early, bed them in. Kieran Tierney's coming to the club. That'll be announced in the next few weeks, you would imagine. So that's a good first step. They're automatically going to be getting a player through the door earlier than what they did last season, because I think it was the first couple of weeks in July where they brought in Sinisalo, I believe, was the first signing, and then Kasper Schmeichel was a couple of days later. So they will be getting a player in early. They've managed to get Kieran Tierney back to the club, which we're all looking forward to seeing once again. But I'd like to see more, and maybe a couple in June, maybe a couple in July. Ahead of that, want to see new players coming in, because I think that can then have an impact on, for example, the pre-season games. I don't know the uptake on the Newcastle game. I know that Newcastle have sold out their allocation. They might actually be looking for more. I've seen a really interesting blog post by one of the Newcastle bloggers saying that they shouldn't be getting that game for free, the Celtic supporters, which was an interesting opinion. But if you bring in new players, then I think that's a great way to appetise fans to come to the grounds and see those new players in action. So the sooner they get new players in, the better. But in order to do that, I think they need to get rid of some of the, not the deadwood, but the players that are whose futures are seen elsewhere.
Just another point. Again, no one's naive here, and I think sometimes when people talk about transfers, I think the counter argument to that is it's so difficult. It's so difficult in this modern market. Even though Celtic have money, it's difficult to navigate all of this. And again, I'm not naive. I understand, that what we're saying here is far from easy. You're asking Celtic to do three things. You're asking them to find the right player, get them in a timely fashion, and then you're asking to replace your best players that may leave. All that's if you get those. Nobody is perfect in football. You don't always get those three things right all the time. But what I'd also say is that those challenges, what we're talking about, they're not unique to Celtic. Every club in the world faces these problems. Like
Yeah.
It's not unique to that. So the excuses don't really wash in that regard for me, because every club across Europe and the world faces those kind of problems.
Yeah, and if Celtic want to be the best that they can be, I think they can take a leaf out of quite a few of those teams' books. Yes, I know that they can't compete with some of the finances that are on display that other teams have in the Champions League, but they can compete with some of those middle teams. The middle teams will be offering similar wages, maybe not in the same league as Celtic in terms of domestic league, so they might have to take a drop down in that. But the Champions League football and potentially the wages as well that they could offer, Celtic are an affluent club that they can compete against some of these teams, and they can also bring their own unique selling points as well. You're playing in front of 60,000. I know I'm bringing out that old sheet, that old script of what to expect when you sign for Celtic, but it's true. It's a really good team to play for, to learn, especially if you're a young player. That will set these players in good stead for what they go on to achieve, hopefully, where they can make Celtic a profit in the long run. That's got to be the aim. I'm totally for the trading model, just so long as it's consistent and as so long as Celtic's quality doesn't drop on the park when players do leave the club.
So there we go. I've laid it all out for me going away, and now we can rest easy and know that I've put all my thoughts out there with regards to Celtic.
6 new signings by the time you're back, John.
Yeah, no, that's how it will go. I tried to deliberately take a break in the quietest week, so next week could be even slower than this one. But no, thanks for everyone joining us today. Thanks for everyone joining us all week. I know I've been hosting all week, and that has been unusual for the people who tune in every day. I think Hamish will be back on Monday at least, chatting through, and we'll have other names and people on the channel over the next week or so as well. Someone asked me, I'm just having a wee holiday. Yeah, I'm just having some time off, and I'll be back the week after. So there'll be plenty of Celtic chat by then, plenty of updates by then, I hope, Ryan.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Anything else you want to add before we head off?
No, good luck to Anthony Ralston tonight against Iceland. I believe Scotland are playing Iceland tonight, so he could maybe get some game time. I know that Max Johnston's been tipped to get some game time for Scotland. It'd be interesting to see him. Maybe a player that Celtic could have looked at a couple of years ago. Maybe potentially could still look at. But yeah, good luck to Anthony Ralston and the Scotland team tonight against Iceland. Not too sure I'll be joining in, but I'll be watching the score from afar.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone in the chat for joining us. Thanks if you're commenting down below. As I say, the Celtic Way will be back on Monday. We've got plenty going out on the website as well, so if you want to take a look at that, celticway.co.uk is your place to go. Thanks, Ryan. Have a great weekend. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you again next time.